Topic 2. To what extent was the League of Nations a success? On the face of it, this is easy to answer. World War II broke out in 1939, and the League of Nations was ultimately an international organisation that was supposed to promote cooperation and ultimately uphold peace. It failed to do that in 1939. However, in the intervening 20 years, the League of Nations was active in international affairs. And of course, it did have some important political successes, as well as undertaking very important social and humanitarian work, which we'll consider as well. So the question is by no means cut and dried, either yes or no. Focus point 1 asks us, how far did weaknesses in the League's organisation make failure inevitable? Let's consider how it was set up. Here in Geneva was to be found this assembly, all of these statesmen and diplomats and officials in their rather smart suits and ties, considering the great issues of the day. On the walls and in the ceilings of the Palais des Nations could be found José María Sert's mural here, in which it represents the coming together in friendship and cooperation of the 5 continents of the globe. Wilson himself decreed that the headquarters should be in a neutral country. Switzerland hadn't, of course, fought in World War I. And so it was that this very idealistic President of America, he had been a professor, in fact, of international politics for a while before he started campaigning to be the president himself. Wilson had these principles at heart. We can call it the principles of internationalism, or Wilsonian internationalism. The starting point of Wilson's vision was that nations should determine their own forms of government. That's to say, they should rule themselves. So national self-determination was the first building block. Now, if those nations have a representation in the League of Nations, we can move towards the second building block, which is this. The League of Nations should work according to collective security. That means to say that members of the League of Nations should all promise that if a member is attacked, if a member is the victim of military aggression, then all of the others are bound to help the victim. The principle of collective security is a principle of everyone in cooperation against the aggressor. The idea was that that would form a kind of deterrence, that if states knew that there was a mechanism of international cooperation to defend a country that was being invaded, then aggression would be much less attractive. You'd realise that you'd be up against a coalition of countries that were all helping each other. So building block 1 and building block 2 then lead to his hoped for outcome. That is to say that he believed that if countries were organised along the principles of self-determination, and they all shared an organisation of collective security, that you would then get to building block 3, which was you would have order and peace. You'd have international order and international peace. you'd have an organisation that was literally upholding, well, of course, upholding the peace treaties that Wilson had just been signing off. Well, what did those peace treaties say? And in this map here, we have a visualization of the new Europe. Of course, the peace treaties also had things to say about Africa and the Middle East, but it's here in Europe that the most significant changes were brought about. Germany, we can see here, is losing territory to Poland. The arrow signifies the Polish corridor going to Poland. We remember that. We remember in the west, the blue section there, Alsace-Lorraine, was then being ceded to France. And then, of course, we'll remember the red in the heart of Europe. That's the dismembered Austro-Hungarian Empire has created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new countries, and then added a bit more to Romania. So these smaller states in Eastern Europe are clearly going to be relatively vulnerable. They're going to be relatively weaker than their larger neighbours to the north and to the west. And so I think it was partly with that in mind that Wilson believed a League of Nations would be necessary to kind of uphold these new arrangements brought about by the Treaty of Versailles, Saint-Germain, Neuilly and Trianon. The League of Nations had a kind of constitution. The word they use is a covenant. And the preamble says something which is worth trying to remember. It says, we respect organised people's rights to deal with one another. So that's the principle of self-determination. And then the second part that might be worth remembering is Article 16. That's the article that you can see for yourself in text that upholds the principle of collective security. The principle that should any member of the League resort to war against another, it shall be considered to have committed an act against all other members of the League. The Covenant also says that it promises to promote international cooperation by the firm establishment of international law. So the principles are clear. What of the organisation itself? It might be worth pausing me and looking at this slide in some detail. It is a diagram of the organisation and structure of the League of Nations. On the right, we have the Assembly of the League. This was the Parliament, I think would be another word, Parliament in which every member had a representative who could speak for that country. Every member had one vote. The Assembly was organised along the principle of one state having one vote. The Assembly obviously could debate anything it wanted. It could make advisory resolutions. It determined the budget, how much the League of Nations spent, what it spent it on. The Assembly of the League elected judges who were to sit in the International Court of Justice. And we'll see below, the International Court of Justice was the court that would decide on matters of international law. So if two countries were in dispute, they could then refer it to the ICJ and ask the ICJ to come up with some kind of judgment. So the ICJ was made up of judges who were trained from all different parts of the world, coming from different member states, and the idea was that that would be the kind of last word on matters of dispute. And then on the left-hand side, we have what we might call the kind of executive, the Council of the League it was called, and the executive was the body of the League of Nations that made decisions that could be then enforced. So Very obviously, the most important, if you like, enforcement actions that were to be made would be imposing economic sanctions. That's to say, determining whether a country could be punished by not trading with it or not communicating with it, preventing it from selling things for profit in other countries, so issues to do with trade embargoes. And then, of course, the Council of the League could go further than that. It could actually organise an enforcement action. It could actually organise a military force in the ways that Wilson envisaged. So the Council of the League was the decision-making body, and its decisions, of course, had to be approved by the Assembly of the League. But it was only able to take those decisions if the Assembly of the League reached a unanimous decision. And this tends to be the first criticism of the way in which the League of Nations was organised. This next slide reminds us of the permanent members being Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan. Those 4 countries would always sit in the Council of the League. They, of course, were the 4 countries that won World War I. America's missing, we'll come to that in a minute. And then they had joining them 4 non-permanent members in 1920. The 4 that were elected for a 2-year period were Belgium, Greece, Spain, and Brazil. And then after they'd done their term, a new 4 were added to that. And in fact, the Council of the League expanded in size in the 1920s to reflect a larger membership. But to all intents and purposes, the Council of the League really only took decisions when Britain and France in particular would say so. So we can see already a criticism of the way it was organised, which was the League of Nations' main decision body. The Council of the League was seen to be the victors' club, it was said. That's to say, it was seen to be driven by Britain and France, the 2 powerful allies that had won World War I. And in that sense, to the USSR, to Germany, those 2 in particular, it looked rather like a club that they were not members of. It looked to be the kind of the vehicle of Allied interest. Now, what Wilson had initially envisaged was, of course, that all the great powers would be in the Council of the League. And this diagram reminds us that that would have meant Britain, it would have meant France, America, it would have meant Germany, it would have meant Russia, or rather Tsar's Russia at that time, it would have meant Italy and probably Japan. They were the 7 great powers, and any international organisation that was to have credibility would require those 7 being part of it. But of course, this is what actually happened. You can see Britain and France at the top were members for the 19 years of its existence, but the Americans voted, the American Senate, I should say, voted not to join in 1920. The Germans weren't invited for a while, and then they left in 1933. And as we go down from the German flag, we can see the Soviet Union was excluded all the way up to 1934 because the Allies wouldn't accept the Bolshevik government as being the legal government of Russia. So the Soviet Union wasn't part of it for a very long time. And then we can see the Italians and the Japanese at the bottom. Although they were founding members, they both left in the 1930s. So what of it? Why was Wilson's organisation, for example, not accepted by the Americans? I mean, this cartoon is very instructive. Here we have a ship, and it's called the ship of the United States. So it symbolises America. And it has to try to steer clear of these dangers, foreign treaties, foreign entanglements, And you can see the League of Nations is also seen as a kind of a danger, an iceberg to the United States. And so the Americans, and this is crucial for the future of the League of Nations, the Americans just took the view that if they joined this international organization, they could be drawn back into the kind of conflict that they'd had to fight in 1917 and 1918. And members of the American public wanted to forget about World War I. They wanted to get on with their lives in the 1920s, free from being entangled in the chronic problems of Europe. Now, with the Americans absent, this cartoon famously depicts the consequences of the absence of America, America being the keystone, the final stone you put in the bridge to make it secure, the bridge that's so necessary to allow movement and freedom and passage across, if you like, the chasms or the big divides that make war possible. America's the keystone, but the Americans are not going to join the club. Another criticism of the League of Nations is not to do with membership, but it's to do with the fact that the League of Nations just didn't have a standing army or a standing navy. It didn't have the ability to enforce decisions under a single command. It really was never attempted. Indeed, the United Nations has very small kind of rapid reaction forces, they're called, but even the United Nations today doesn't actually have a single structure, a single army or navy. So we'll certainly include that as one of the organisational weaknesses of the League of Nations, although it might be, on balance, a rather harsh criticism of it. It was almost impossible to imagine the circumstances in which members of this organisation would willingly hand over their own soldiers and their own ships to be governed by some figure of the League of Nations. That didn't happen, and to be honest, it hasn't happened under the United Nations either. Focus point 2 asks us, how successful was the League of Nations in the 1920s? We're going to consider 5 disputes, all of which could have spilled out into all-out war, but they didn't. The first one is in the Baltic Sea over the Åland Islands. Now, they were disputed by Sweden and Finland. Why was that? Well, the Åland Islands were ruled by the Finns, and the Finns had been part of the Russian Empire, but now the Russian Empire had gone and the Finns were ruling themselves. And the Finns looked at the Åland Islands and would like to do more for the Finnish minority. They ruled the islands, but of course there was a Swedish majority. So that made the Swedes concerned. Now Finland was on its own. Now Finland could do what it liked with its territories. Would the Finns in the Åland Islands, who were in a minority, would they be treated better than the Swedes? Would they have better rights than the Swedes? All of this concerned the Åland Swedes. So what did they do? The Åland Swedes appealed to Sweden itself, to mainland Sweden, and said, we want to become part of Sweden. Now, this is a kind of classic dispute for the League of Nations to deal with. They've got a number of options here, I suppose. They could award the islands to Sweden, or they could cut the island in two, I suppose. They could have done that kind of thing. They could have just not done anything at all. They could have set it up to the Åland Islanders to resolve. But it was referred to the International Court of Justice. Now, we've got the building here on the top right-hand side. That's where the courts are. They're in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And there are 3 main parts of their judgment. One was that the islands should remain formally under Finland under Finnish sovereignty would be a better word to use. But that was to be modified by the fact that now, number 2, the Swedes should have self-government. That's to say that the Swedes could have their own kind of assembly and they could make up their own rules. And then the third point was that the island should be demilitarized. There couldn't be any kind of threat of the Finns using armed force or anything like that, or the Swedes for that matter. So we can say that that's a fairly major success, and it was accepted by both the Finnish government and the Swedish government. The second case study is in Upper Silesia. This dispute boils up in 1921. There's fighting between the Poles and the Germans. You'll see this red section is mainly German speaking, the blue section is mainly Polish speaking, and also Upper Silesia is important because it's got some of the most rich coal mines in Europe. Now, the Treaty of Versailles had actually said there must be a vote, and all these small regions would vote. Do you want to be part of Germany or do you want to be part of Poland? The problem was that Germans and Poles started fighting, and the League of Nations voted that troops should be sent to firstly try and stop that fighting, but then secondly that troops should be sent to oversee that a fair plebiscite was held. Now that does indeed happen. I've put in here mention of the Conference of Ambassadors because it's not really the League of Nations that ultimately made that decision. Anything to do with enforcing the peace treaties was ultimately made by the Big Four, who sat in conference to determine that the treaties were being carried out over these years, over 1920, 21, 22. You'll see the slide says the decision of the Conference of Ambassadors, well, there are 2 main things. 1, to hold a plebiscite, and 2, to award territory by national ethnicity. Ultimately, the League can take some credit for making sure that the Upper Silesia argument didn't become an all-out war between Germany and Poland. The third one is about the small Greek island of Corfu, which was shelled by Mussolini's navy. Why? General Tellini, an Italian general, and 4 of his staff were shot by Greeks on the border with Albania. Tellini's men were trying to map a new frontier, and the Greeks were pretty sure that they were far too far south. That's to say, they were claiming too much territory for Albania because Albania was friendly to Italy. Is that why these men were shot? The Greek government said they were just shot by locals who didn't know who they were. Mussolini didn't accept that, so he retaliated. And the best way of doing that, he thought, was to shell a bit of Greece. He chose the island of Corfu. You can see there the map where there's a red spot. That's a very small island, the island of Corfu. Having shelled it and occupying it, the Italians then said, we want an apology and we want you to pay 50 million lira. The Greeks handed the situation over to the League of Nations. Now, here is the problem. The League of Nations then handed it over to what we've just talked about, the Conference of Ambassadors, and that was because it was considered to be a dispute over fulfilling the peace treaties. So in the end, the League of Nations kind of pulled out of it. Greece was ordered to apologise and pay the indemnity, and the Italian-made border between Albania and Greece was accepted. And this cartoon tells the story. Ultimately, of course, Italy was one of the 4 most important members of the organisation. It was, of course, a permanent member of the Council of the League. So you can argue that the League of Nations was hypocritical in its treatment of Greece. Why was there a dispute over Vilnius in 1920? Now, this was a part of Lithuania, a new country created after World War I, and it had a Polish minority. The Polish minority rebelled against the Lithuanian government and appealed to the Poles, and a Polish general called General Zeligowski responded with force. He invaded with the Polish army, and Lithuania then appealed to the League. And we've got a map here showing how close Vilnius was to the Polish border. Again, a classic situation for the League of Nations to deal with. But once again, it was handed over to the Conference of Ambassadors, and the Conference of Ambassadors ruled that Vilnius should be part of Poland because it was majority Polish. And again, this doesn't look good for the League. It seems as if Poland, a very important ally, particularly to France after World War I, was being given some preferential treatment. So probably not a success. Our last case study in the 1920s surrounds the so-called War of the Stray Dog between Greece and Bulgaria in 1925. How does it get its name? Well, a soldier, a Greek soldier, had a dog which wandered over the border at Petrik here from Greece into Bulgaria, and he chased after it, and when he chased after it, he was killed. The Greek General Pangalos, decided that that was grounds to invade. He went across the border with his troops. They killed about 40 civilians. They laid waste to some villages, and they demanded an apology from the Bulgarian government. Well, the Bulgarian government refused to apologise and referred the matter of the invasion to the League of Nations. And this was the decision that the League took. They thought there were no grounds for invasion. In fact, they asked Greece to apologise, and Greece had to pay a fine for the damage they'd caused to the villagers. And the Greeks were ordered to withdraw. Pangalos, in fact, fled. Now, this was a decision that can be commended because, of course, it wasn't really about a dog at all. The Greeks had already got some territory from Bulgaria as a consequence of the Treaty of Neuilly and wanted more. It was part of testing whether they could get away with a land grab of their neighbour Bulgaria, and they didn't manage to do it. On the basis of these studies, we can think more broadly about the question: were there successes and were there failures? And you can probably see that the successes were most obviously to do with the Ireland Islands and the Bulgarian-Greek War. There are two that were rather well handled. Now, why is that the case? On the left-hand side, we've got these three things. Firstly, if the great powers' interests were not at stake, so there were no great powers involved in the Ireland Islands disputes, and there were no great powers involved in the Greek-Bulgarian disputes. Greece, Bulgaria, Sweden, Finland are small countries, and of course they're relatively evenly balanced. If military force was required, that was a problem for the League of Nations, but in fact in these two cases there was no military force required. Finland and Sweden and Greece and Bulgaria were prepared to do what they were told. And thirdly, if both sides were prepared to accept the verdict of the League, or the verdict of the League's court, the ICJ, then the League of Nations was able to stand up and be heard. And of course that was the case in both of these disputes. I've left the column on the right-hand side blank, and you can think that through for yourself. So there are failures in the 1920s, obviously, when great powers' interests are at stake. So, for instance, in the Corfu incident, Italy's interests were at stake, and so consequently that was a failure. Equally, so far in the 1920s, military force is not required. I suppose in the case of Vilnius, you could say that the only way they were going to stop the Polish general was by sending force, and they didn't do that. So there was an early sign in the Vilnius dispute that if a small country like Lithuania was faced with an invasion by a larger neighbour, then the League of Nations would really have to marshal some kind of army, some kind of military response, and that didn't happen in Vilnius. And thirdly, the League of Nations is shown to be weak when sides are not prepared to accept its verdicts. And we will see now in the 1930s that when that is true, and when you have very determined and powerful countries that are not prepared to accept the verdict of the ICJ or the verdict of the General Assembly or the Security Council, then the League of Nations was shown to be weak. Before we do that, we are going to look at the social and humanitarian work of the League. On the bottom left, you can see the LNHO, or League of Nations Health Organization. Now, this had some progress in tackling diseases such as leprosy, smallpox, typhoid, and a biggest killer of all, cholera. That's to say, a waterborne disease. And through improving water sources, improving sewage and so on, the League of Nations was able to promote measures against cholera and against the other diseases I've mentioned. So health was a new area of work, and we cannot underestimate the importance of that, particularly in Africa and Asia. In the top left-hand side, we've got the logo for the International Labour Organization. The League of Nations was committed to the suppression of slavery and the slave trade. It was also committed to work improving organisation of workers, such as promoting the creation of trades unions in some parts of the world. It wasn't always successful. Slavery remained in some parts of the world. Workers' rights weren't legally enforceable in some parts of the world. But the League of Nations was taking the lead in these areas. And again, it must have had and did have significant areas of success in some parts of the world in which malpractice and mistreatment of workers was rife. You've also got here the logo on the top right-hand side for the Universal Postal Union. Now, Woodrow Wilson's idea of an international order, his idea of international cooperation, was promoted by the idea that communication around the world should be cheap, effective, and easily organised. So, what the UPU did was coordinate the postal services of the world into one overarching structure. So if I post a letter addressed to another continent, I can be confident it will arrive because the two postal unions were talking to one another through this league agency. So health, labour, communication. The fourth logo we have is the Mandate Commission. We've got here a text for the mandate for Palestine. And again, this was a very important part of the League of Nations work. Mandates were territories that had belonged to the defeated nations, notably Germany and the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey. Those two countries had empires that they lost after World War I, and the territories were then turned into League of Nations mandates. So, for example, Tanganyika, which we now call Tanzania, was German East Africa. Britain became the country that was mandated to rule Tanganyika. And the League of Nations Mandate Commission had the job of supervising how the British administered it. And that meant that Britain was obliged to include Tanganyikans in the running of that country in order to kind of prepare them for ultimately independence. So the Mandates Commissions were kind of watchdogs that made sure that countries that were mandated to rule these former colonies did so effectively and, so far as possible, relatively humanely. Needless to say, that wasn't a standard that was always upheld. Here we've got the mandate for Palestine. That's one of the most controversial of the mandates. That was a British mandate. But it meant that every year Britain was obliged to report to the League of Nations in order to give an account of what was happening in Palestine and what steps the British were taking to prepare Palestine ultimately for independence. Fifthly, in the middle of the bottom row, we have the emblem for the Refugee Commission. Of course, refugees were a major humanitarian problem for the League of Nations after World War I, notably Greek refugees from the Turkish mainland. And the League of Nations organised some relief and some evacuation for Greeks fleeing Turkey in 1919. On the other hand, they didn't do much for Jewish refugees in the 1930s. Let's go to this slide for a summary of the humanitarian work of the League of Nations. In health, there were some advances. In tackling disease, although none of the diseases mentioned on that slide were eradicated. In terms of labour, there was some advance, suppressing the slave trade, some advances encouraging trades unions, although workers' rights were by no means enforceable by the League of Nations. We've talked about communication, and the Universal Postal Service was established and recognised as a wholesale success. We've talked about the Mandates Commissions that up to a point supervised, particularly Britain and France, in administrating their mandates, although of course there were significant weaknesses in terms of what the League of Nations could tell Britain and France to do. And lastly, we've talked about the Refugee Commission, which certainly helped the situation of Greeks leaving Turkey in 1919, 1920, but later on in the 1930s did, to be honest, very, very little to help the Jewish situation, to help the refugees fleeing persecution at the hands of the Nazis in the 1930s. Focus point 3 asks us, how far did the Great Depression make the work of the League more difficult? This slide shows the decline of world trade. It collapsed by 2/3 between 1929 to 1932. And here we have a graph that shows the sudden collapse in Japanese exports of silk to the USA in the same time. Now, how are the two connected? Of course, Japan was heavily dependent on selling silk goods to particularly America's richer classes. And when the Wall Street crash happened, ladies like this lady on the right, she and her husband were not able to afford these kind of luxury goods. Now, if Japan couldn't sell silk in return for dollars, that meant that Japan did not have the dollars to buy the very many raw materials that Japan couldn't get hold of. For example, oil here on the left, we've got rubber on the right and soy underneath. And those three staples were very, very important to the Japanese economy. So as the situation got worse, by 1931, the Japanese military were beginning to pour enormous pressure on the government to reach a military solution to Japan's raw materials problems. And that basically meant invading Manchuria. This was a very weakly defended part of China because China was in civil war. And therefore, by invading this part of China, the Japanese knew that they could get control of farmland and feed their population. They staged a fake terrorist attack here at Mukden in September 1931. The slide here is of a Chinese suspect who's been accused of blowing up a part of the railway, and this photograph supposedly shows officials who found the bit of the railway that's been damaged. Now, did these Chinese workers sabotage the Manchurian railway? It was highly unlikely. It was the excuse, though, that the Japanese military were looking for to attack. And here we have a map of China during its civil war, and you can see the red bits are all kind of split apart from one another, representing the different warlords of China who controlled different parts of the collapsed empire. So Japan knew that China was in such internal turmoil that now was the opportunity to invade, and they did so. What they need, though, is a kind of puppet to hide behind, and they use this figure, Pu Yi. He was actually the former Chinese emperor who'd been overthrown by the Chinese warlords, but the Japanese rather cleverly restore him as Emperor Pu Yi of, they use the Japanese name Manchukuo rather than Manchuria, Manchukuo. So the Emperor Pu Yi of Manchukuo was now ruling a territory, or rather seemed to be ruling a territory that was really controlled by the Japanese army. So therefore, as this slide says, Japan had invaded China, it had disrupted the international order, and it had set up a puppet government. What was the League of Nations going to do about it? One of the problems for the Chinese was that there was no single government that the League of Nations could agree on that was actually in control of China. As we've seen, China had effectively collapsed into small warlordships, we could call them, or small units that weren't really a sovereign government. So who was the spokesman for China? That was a significant problem. There wasn't one. The League of Nations therefore had to go and try and find out information for itself. The man who was chosen was Lord Lytton, a British official. Lord Lytton leads a commission that travels east. It travelled to Tokyo, it then travelled to Manchuria to look at the evidence, and then travelled back. Lytton had to go by sea, of course. There was no air flights that were possible to take in those days, which meant that between December 1931 and October 1932, when he finally delivered his report, that gave the Japanese a further 10, 11 months or so to strengthen their position in Manchuria. Once the Lytton report was digested in the General Assembly and voted on, the League of Nations decided to condemn the Japanese as the illegal aggressors in the General Assembly, but they went no further than that, and this cartoon represents that fact rather well. We have the League of Nations officials bowing, we have the League represented as a maid being literally trampled over by a Japanese general. The face-saving outfit there is the attempt to try to make it look as if the League of Nations is doing the honourable thing. It's condemned the Japanese, but the underlying message, of course, is that it's only doing that. It's saving face but not resisting Japanese aggression. So why was the League unable to protect Manchuria? There are four main reasons. One was that there was essentially no international resolve. There was no particularly strong will amongst Britain and France in particular to protect Manchuria with military force, even if they could. Reason for that was that Manchuria was not part of their empires or was of any particular economic interest to them, and so the Japanese were kind of left to it. The second point is that the Great Depression itself, that's to say the item that's mentioned in the focus question, the economic meltdown that was global at this point, had really weakened government finances. French, British governments, Italian governments, if Mussolini had been willing, but of course he wasn't. These governments were really concerned about their own public finances. They were having to pay for unemployment benefit, they were having to pay to try to reconstruct their industries that were collapsing at this point. There was very little money to go around to fund an expensive overseas expedition. The third point might well be the key one. Which great power was concerned about the rise of Japan in the Western Pacific? And that was, of course, the United States of America. But the USA was absent from the League of Nations. The Americans were never going to be able to lead any kind of League of Nations coalition. 20 years later, they would in Korea, of course, but at this point, America was not only absent, but isolationist. And the fourth point we've already touched upon is that China just didn't have a recognized government. It was dissolved in civil war. And therefore, it wasn't one single ruler that was able to go to Geneva and say, my people have been attacked. And so we've seen in this case study just how far the Great Depression weakens the ability and the resolve of the League of Nations to defend its members. So this focus point, how successful was the League in the 1930s? We've already partly answered. You can put down the Manchurian dispute as a failure. Where else could the League operate? In what other disputes should this international organisation have made a difference? Let's take Italy as the next case study. Here we have Mussolini with his fascist salute on the left-hand side. Here he is on horseback in front of the Colosseum. Why? Well, because he has the ambition of constructing an Italian empire that would be worthy of comparison with the Roman Empire. In October 1935, he invades Abyssinia, which is one of only two remaining independent African states. He was trying to rival the empires of his neighbours, France and Britain. He was attempting to avenge the memory of a very humiliating defeat at Adwa in 1896. But really, he was attempting to win his public support. He thought that through a foreign adventure, he could deflect some criticism of what was happening at home and make Italians feel that Italy was entering some glorious new age. So here we have Abyssinians being forced to perform the fascist salute in front of this vast portrait of Mussolini. And here the Emperor Haile Selassie is imploring to the League of Nations. He's saying, here I've been attacked. I'm one of only two independent African members of the League of Nations, and you have a duty to defend me. Well, which member states would he be addressing his comments to? Almost certainly Britain and France. The Japanese, by this stage, had left the League of Nations. Italy was the other permanent member, and Italy was his assailant. So it was only the British and the French that could possibly save Abyssinia from this invasion. And here was the problem. Samuel Hoare met with Pierre Laval in secret, and they drew up a pact. And their pact was to split Abyssinia in two, for Haile Selassie to hold on to his capital, Addis Ababa, and the surrounding region. But then 2/3 of his kingdom was to be awarded to the Italian invaders. Now, there is no way that League of Nations General Assembly would have accepted that. And here was the problem. The pact was leaked to the Times newspaper, who published what Hoare and Laval were planning to do. There was, of course, horror in the League and in Geneva, because the two states that should have been upholding Abyssinia were giving 2/3 of it away. Hoare and Laval had to resign. Britain and France had to apologise. And so Mussolini got away with it. Some economic sanctions were passed, but they were really minimal. And Mussolini was delighted to learn that there was no prescription on the export of oil, which was the one thing which would have really stopped the Italian fleet and Italian trucks. A major problem was that his friend Hitler, of course, was able to supply the very many things that he needed. So economic sanctions would never probably worked in the first place. Is it fair to criticise failures of the League of Nations on its structure and organisation by 1936? This table helps us answer this question. On the one hand, you can say that the weakness of the powers of the Council of the League was such that the Council of the League were never really able to enforce their decisions. You can argue that the International Court of Justice only worked if both sides accepted its decision, and that was a fatal error. You could argue the League of Nations never set up an army and never had a navy, and so the great powers were always going to be stronger than the League of Nations. And then you can go on to say that because membership was not universal and great powers were absent, certainly in the 1930s, there was not enough strength amongst the League of Nations membership for it to be a deterrent to aggressors. The arguments look stronger on the other side, though. It's really the emergence of new kinds of governments, and by that I mean Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany as well. It's the emergence of these kinds of governments which really undermine the world order. Secondly, we know that the economic challenges of the Great Depression were so overwhelming that even willing governments were not really able to afford the kinds of interventions that were necessary. And then we come to the third and fourth point, which I think probably are the most powerful ones. And that's to say that rather than blaming the way the League of Nations is set up, we should look at the member states of the League of Nations. We should look at who is in the League of Nations and whether they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So what's happening in this photo? Of course, Hitler is shaking hands with Chamberlain in September 1938. We'll be revising this in topic 3. It's the high point of appeasement. Chamberlain is doing a deal here over Czechoslovakia. He's about to award the Sudetenland to Germany. Now, who should be trying to resolve this dispute? Of course, it should be the League of Nations, and therefore we can say that by 1938, collective responsibility has collapsed. The Czechs can't operate through the League of Nations. The League of Nations was too weak in 1938 to deal with Hitler. And therefore, in September 1939, Hitler invades Poland And the League of Nations as such has nothing to say about that. And therefore, on this last slide, we have Hitler saluting his forces. War broke out in September 1939. The Poles did not appeal to the League of Nations. The League of Nations had ceased to function. Peace had collapsed. And it's the collapse of peace in the 1930s which is our next topic.